in the outer chambers of the Galactic Concord, where 1,000 species sent their delegates and where decisions shaped the fate of star systems. The general belief about Earth had been fixed for generations, written into reports and repeated in strategy briefings, that humans were a young, emotional species, good trait, quick to talk about cooperation, slow to threaten, and almost allergic to war beyond their own small region of space. And when Ambassador Helen Carter stood before the tall, many-eyed representatives of the Tsar Collective and the armored envoys of the Korl Dominion, she carried that reputation like an invisible weight, speaking calmly about border violations and the need for mutual respect, while the aliens listened with thinly hidden boredom, because to them humans were a background species, useful for labor contracts and minor research partnerships, but not something that could ever challenge an established power. And this attitude had only grown stronger after centuries of observing humanity settle disputes with words, treaties, and compromise instead of open conquest. So when the Coral War Council authorized the probe fleet to enter a human-protected system and strip mine its outer worlds, they did so with the same casual confidence a hunter has when stepping into a forest known to hold only small prey, expecting perhaps a protest, maybe a formal complaint to the Concord, certainly not resistance. And in the early days their expectations seemed correct. As human patrols tracked the intruders, recorded their actions, and transmitted warnings in clear, controlled language that asked for withdrawal and cited interstellar law, while on Earth and its colonies military leaders like Admiral Paul Grant and General Laura Mitchell watched the feeds in silence, noting every formation, every power signature, every tactic, not with panic, but with a focused, calm professionals who had trained for a day they hoped would never come. And in briefing rooms, across human space analysts compiled centuries of doctrine, lessons learned from wars that had once scarred their own planet, strategies built on the understanding that survival often depended not on appearing strong, but on knowing exactly when to stop appearing harmless. And as the Coral continued their operations, pushing deeper, ignoring warnings, and even firing on a small human survey ship to drive it away, the political leadership of Earth convened an emergency session where President Daniel Harper listened to reports and then asked a simple question that cut through all the discussion: whether the time had come to reveal the war doctrine that had been quietly prepared and never shown to any off-world power, a doctrine built on total commitment, layered defense, rapid escalation, and the belief that if humanity was ever forced into a major conflict, it would fight not to prove a point but to end the threat completely. And while some advisors still hoped for a diplomatic solution, the steady advance of the coral fleets and the dismissive tone of their commanders, who spoke of humans as a soft species that would fold once real pressure was applied, made it clear that restraint was being read as weakness, not as choice. And so orders were issued in calm voices that carried enormous weight, activating deep space command networks, bringing reserve fleets out of quiet patrol routes, and shifting industrial output from civilian expansion to full military readiness. All done without public drama, without speeches of anger, just a measured transition from peace posture to war footing that had been practiced in simulations for decades. And when Ambassador Carter returned to Concord and formally accused the Korl Dominion of armed aggression, the response from the Korl representative was a thin smile and a statement that their operations were internal security matters, that humans should focus on their own systems and leave serious military affairs to those with real experience, a remark that drew soft amusement from several other delegates who shared the old view of humanity as earnest, but ultimately inconsequential. And yet in the data channels of human command, something fundamental had shifted, because the war doctrine, once theoretical, was now active, and its first principle was that the opening move in any existential conflict must remove the enemy's confidence in their assumptions. So as the coral fleets continued to mine and fortify, believing they were establishing a forward base in what would soon be uncontested space, they failed to notice the subtle changes in the background, the sudden quiet of certain human shipping lanes, the disappearance of civilian traffic that had once been constant, the emergence of encrypted signals that their intelligence dismissed as routine, and the repositioning of human vessels that, on the surface, looked like routine patrol rotations, but in reality formed the first layers of a multi-domain net designed to isolate, surround, and study the intruding force in detail. And on Earth, in a secure operations center, officers reviewed the long-kept sections of their strategic manuals, sections that spoke of coordinated strikes across space, cyber, and information domains of overwhelming force applied not in scattered blows, but in a single, decisive sequence of the importance of timing so precise that the enemy would have no window to adapt. And while the galaxy still saw humanity as a species that preferred negotiation and slow consensus, those within the system knew that beneath that surface lay a culture that had learned, through its own brutal history, that peace was protected not by good intentions alone, but by the credible ability to impose unbearable costs on any who threatened it. And as the Korl commanders boasted to their allies that the humans would soon accept the new reality and retreat from the contested systems, human reconnaissance drones slipped unnoticed into optimal positions, mapping every weapon array, every command node, every logistic hub, building a complete picture that would soon be fed into targeting networks guided by doctrines that emphasize precision, speed, and psychological impact as much as raw firepower. And so the stage was set for the moment when the galaxy's long-held belief would collide with a truth it had never been forced to face, that the peaceful posture of humanity had never been a sign of inability, only of choice, and that when that choice was taken away, what emerged was not chaos or reckless rage, but a cold, organized, and carefully prepared way of war that would soon demonstrate to the Korl Dominion and to every watching power that the era of dismissing humans as a minor, harmless species was about to end. As the Korl Task Force expanded its operations and began constructing what it called a permanent security bastion in the disputed system, their commanders sent confident reports back to their home Dominion, describing the humans as compliant and slow, noting that no counterfire had been returned and that all communications from Earth continued to be phrased in careful legal language, which the Korl interpreted as hesitation and fear, and this interpretation spread through their officer corps, shaping every decision that followed, because they began to assume that time was on their side and that the humans would eventually accept the new status quo, but in the hidden layers of human command situation was being treated not as a border dispute, but as the opening phase of a test that would determine whether the species would remain a minor regional power or step into a role it had long prepared for but never sought. And Admiral Paul Grant reviewed the latest intelligence with his staff, pointing out patterns in Korl fleet movements, the rigid way their formations held a doctrine, the predictable cycles of their patrols and resupply, and he spoke quietly about how such rigidity had doomed many forces in human history when they faced an opponent willing to adapt, while General Lord Mitchell coordinated planetary defense and expeditionary forces, ensuring that every colony within several jumps was ready to shift from civilian routines to wartime discipline without public panic, because the war doctrine emphasized continuity of society even under threat, the idea that morale and order were as decisive as weapons, and so broadcast to the population spoke of exercises and readiness checks rather than invasion, while behind-the-scenes transport corridors were cleared, emergency shelters were stocked, and reserve units were quietly mobilized. And in the halls of the Galactic Concord, the mood remained dismissive, with several major powers privately advising Earth to avoid escalation and to accept limited losses in exchange for stability, repeating the old belief that survival for a young species depended on knowing when to yield. And Ambassador Helen Carter listened to these suggestions with calm expression, recording every word, because she understood that the moment the doctrine was revealed, these same voices would claim surprise and deny having encouraged submission, and she prepared formal statements that would later be entered into the Concords. Archives, not as pleas, but as evidence that humanity had followed every legal and diplomatic path before turning to force. And when the Korl representative publicly announced that their security zone would be enforced by lethal means, and that any human vessel entering without permission would be destroyed, the declaration was met with routine procedural responses, yet within human space it triggered the next phase of preparation, the activation of integrated command structures that linked naval, aerospace, cyber, and intelligence assets into a single operational web, a system designed so that decisions could be made and executed in seconds rather than hours. And in simulation rooms, officers ran through scenarios of first contact turning violent, calculating not only how to neutralize Korl ships, but how to collapse their ability to coordinate, to communicate, to understand what was happening, because the doctrine taught that confusion in the enemy ranks could be as powerful as any weapon. And as these preparations continued, the Korl began to encounter subtle anomalies, sensor echoes that did not match known traffic, brief signal interruptions that their technicians blamed on local interference, and occasional glimpses of human vessels at extreme range that vanished before identification, all of which were logged and then largely dismissed because their confidence in human passivity remained unshaken. And this confidence was reinforced when a Korl patrol destroyed an unarmed human monitoring platform near one of the mine worlds, and no immediate retaliation followed, leading their commanders to conclude that they could escalate at will, unaware that the lack of response was not hesitation but restraint, a deliberate choice to let the intruders reveal more of their capabilities and intentions. And in a secure briefing, President Daniel Harper met with senior civilian and military leaders, where the final authorization thresholds were reviewed, the conditions under which the full doctrine would be enacted, and he listened as analysts explained that the Korl had now crossed multiple red lines, including the use of force against human assets and the establishment of permanent military infrastructure in protected space. And when Harper gave his quiet approval to move to the next stage, there were no cheers, no dramatic speeches, only the steady acknowledgement that a path had been chosen and that it would not be easily reversed and across. Human-controlled systems, the effects of that decision began to ripple outward as shipyards shifted to continuous operations, as training cycles were compressed, as command crews took their stations for what they understood might be a prolonged and decisive conflict, and in the data cores of human fleets, the war doctrine's operational plans, refined over generations, were unlocked, detailing synchronized strikes, layered defenses, and the careful sequencing of actions designed to demonstrate not only strength but resolve. And still the galaxy watched with indifference, convinced that any clash would be brief and limited, that the humans would learn their place and return to negotiation, not realizing that the very patience they mistook for weakness was in fact a final preparation before a response that would challenge every assumption they held about what a peaceful species could become when its survival and its dignity were placed at risk. When the first true test came, it did not arrive with a grand fleet engagement, but with a small, calculated incident that revealed how far the situation had shifted as a Korl destroyer squadron moved to intercept and seize a human logistics vessel traveling between two colonies, an action they justified internally as a demonstration of authority and externally as routine inspection. And when the human ship altered course and transmitted a calm refusal, citing sovereign transit rights, the Korl commander ordered warning shots that deliberately grazed the vessel's shields, expecting the usual pattern of retreat and protest. But instead the human captain, a veteran officer named Richard Hale, maintained course and transmitted a brief message acknowledging the hostile act and stating that the incident would be reported, a response that struck the Korl bridge crew as oddly restrained and formal given the situation. And before they could decide whether to escalate further, the human vessel executed a precise series of maneuvers that placed it just beyond their optimal firing arcs and then accelerated out of range. Not in panic, but with controlled efficiency, a small detail that would later be studied by analysts as the first visible sign that human crews were operating under a different set of expectations, one that assumed confrontation rather than avoided it. And as the Korl filed their report and moved on, satisfied that they had asserted dominance, the data from that encounter was fed into human command networks, confirming assumptions about Korl targeting priorities, reaction times, and rules of engagement, and in operation centers across human space. Planners updated their models, refining the sequence of actions that would soon be executed on a much larger scale, and in the days that followed, similar encounters occurred, each one carefully measured, each one drawing out a little more information, a little more certainty, until the picture of the intruding force was complete enough to satisfy the strict thresholds set by the Doctrine. And it was at this point that Admiral Paul Grant convened a final readiness review with fleet commanders, outlining transition from observation to action, explaining that the first phase would not be a traditional battle, but a coordinated demonstration designed to shatter the Korl belief in human passivity and to expose the vulnerability of their forward deployment. And he emphasized that discipline and timing would be critical, that every unit would act according to a synchronized plan that left no room for improvisation in the opening moments, because the psychological impact of perfect coordination was a weapon in itself. And as these orders were distributed, crews across multiple task forces prepared in silence, checking systems, reviewing engagement protocols, and internalizing the rules that govern escalation, rules that balance the need for decisive action with the obligation to limit unnecessary destruction, reflecting a doctrine shaped by a long history of understanding both the cost of war and the necessity of winning it quickly when it could not be avoided. And while human forces prepared, the Korl continued to expand their installations, bringing in additional ships and heavy platforms, confident that their show of strength would deter any serious challenge. And in communications intercepted by human intelligence, Korl officers spoke openly of the humans as a species that would protest loudly but ultimately accept whatever settlement was imposed, a belief so deeply ingrained that it shaped their security posture, leading them to cluster assets in ways that optimize control but reduce resilience. And this clustering was precisely the vulnerability the Doctrine sought to exploit, because it allowed for the possibility of neutralizing multiple critical nodes in rapid succession, creating a cascade of confusion and loss of coordination. And as the final preparations reached completion, President Daniel Harper authorized the execution of the initial operational sequence, a limited but unmistakable action that would mark the moment when humanity's long-maintained image as a purely peaceful power would give way to a new, more complex reality. And in the quiet before that moment, Ambassador Helen Carter submitted a final formal notice to the Galactic Concord, documenting the Korl violations and stating that all diplomatic remedies had been exhausted, a statement that would later be cited in countless debates and historical analyses, but at the time drew little attention from delegates who still believed that whatever followed would be a minor skirmish at most, and so the galaxy remained largely unaware that it stood on the edge of a demonstration that would redefine its understanding of human capability and intent, that would show that beneath centuries of cooperation and restraint lay a doctrine that, once activated, moved with deliberate speed and overwhelming coordination, and that the first visible signs of this doctrine's application were about to appear in a way that would leave no doubt that the era of easy assumptions about humanity was coming to an end. The opening move came without warning in the way the Korl understood that word, yet it followed every formal step that human law and doctrine required, because at precisely the time stated in the final notice to the Galactic Concord, a coordinated sequence unfolded across the contested system, beginning not with visible weapons fire, but with sudden and comprehensive disruption of Korl command and control. As their encrypted channels filled with noise, their relay buoys went silent one after another, and their internal networks began to lag and fragment under a wave of precision cyber operations that had been prepared and tested for years. And on the bridges of Korl ships, officers barked orders that took seconds longer than usual to reach their crews, then failed to reach them at all, creating small gaps in coordination that human planners had calculated down to the fraction of a second, and into those gaps moved the first elements of the human fleet, emerging from previously unremarkable patrol routes in deep space, holding positions and formations that were tight, layered, and unmistakably purposeful, and unlike the scattered or cautious deployments the Korl had expected, these forces advanced in synchronized groups, each task unit covering the others, each movement timed to coincide with another disruption in Korl sensor coverage, so that by the time the intruders were fully detected, they were already in positions that challenged the Korl defensive layout. And on the flagship of the Korl task force, the commanding officer attempted to reestablish full situational awareness, ordering reserve ships to redeploy and weapons to come online, only to find that targeting solutions were incomplete and that the usual automated coordination routines were failing, forcing reliance on slower, manual processes. And it was in this moment of growing uncertainty that the first direct engagement occurred, as a human strike group executed a focused attack on a Korl communications hub platform, disabling it with a combination of electronic warfare and precision fire that left the structure largely intact but non-functional, a choice that reflected the Doctrine's emphasis on paralyzing the enemy's ability to coordinate rather than simply destroying assets. And as the hub went dark, the Korl formation lost its primary link to higher command, isolating the forward elements in the system, and almost simultaneously similar actions were carried out against sensor, arrays, and logistics nodes, each strike timed so that the effects overlapped, creating a cascading loss of awareness and control that spread to Korl force faster than their officers could adapt. And in the midst of this unfolding situation, human vessels maintained disciplined formations and control rates of advance, neither rushing blindly nor hesitating, their movements conveying a level of preparation that contradicted every assumption the Korl had held about their opponents. And when Korl gunners finally brought several human ships into firing solutions and launch volleys, The response was immediate and measured, defensive systems absorbing the attacks, while return fire was directed with precision at specific emitters and weapon mounts, reducing Korl offensive capability without unnecessary destruction of hulls, a tactic designed to demonstrate dominance and control rather than indiscriminate force. And as the engagement expanded, the Korl command structure struggled to impose order, issuing fragmented directives that arrived out of sequence or not at all, while human commanders, operating within an integrated network, adjusted their actions in real time, closing in on key positions and tightening the operational net. And throughout the system, smaller core units found themselves isolated, cut off from clear instructions, facing opponents who anticipated their movements and countered them before they could be fully executed. And in these encounters, the difference in doctrine became starkly visible, as human crews acted according to pre-planned contingencies that assumed disruption and confusion, while Korl crews, trained to operate within rigid hierarchies and stable communication links, hesitated when those links failed. And in the Galactic Concord, news of the first clashes began to filter into delayed and incomplete reports, initially described as localized skirmishes. But the tone of the updates soon shifted as it became clear that the scale and coordination of the human response far exceeded what had been expected, and Ambassador Helen Carter, receiving real-time briefings through secure channels, prepared to address the assembly, not with threats or boasts, but with a factual account of events that framed the action as the execution of a defensive doctrine long kept in reserve, a doctrine now revealed not as a tool of conquest, but as a structured, disciplined means of ensuring that any power that chose the test. Humanity's resolve would face a response that was swift, comprehensive, and unmistakably decisive, and as the first phase of operations continued to unfold, it became evident to those directly involved that the galaxy's image of humans as merely peaceful negotiators was being replaced, in the most concrete way possible, by the reality of a species that had prepared for war with the same seriousness and care that it had devoted to peace. As the disruption deepened and the Korl forward force struggled to regain cohesion, the second layer of the human war doctrine came into effect, a phase designed to translate initial paralysis into irreversible strategic disadvantage. And this phase unfolded through a series of tightly coordinated maneuvers that targeted not just ships and platforms, but the assumptions that guided Korl decision-making, because while their commanders attempted to pull back into defensive formations around their largest installations, human task groups executed feints and control withdrawals that drew Korl units into overextending, then closed those gaps with precision strikes that severed mutual support between their elements. And in the process, several Korl cruisers found themselves isolated, their escorts out of position, their communications intermittent, and their captains forced to choose between holding ground and risking encirclement or retreating, and leaving critical infrastructure exposed. And in these moments, the contrast in operational culture became even clearer, as human commanders accepted temporary risk to create long-term advantage, shifting formations fluidly, trusting in shared situational awareness and delegated authority, while Korl officers waited for centralized directives that were slow to arrive or contradicted by fragmented intelligence. And in one engagement near a partially completed Korl fortification array, a human squadron executed a complex sequence of electronic interference and kinetic precision that disabled the array's power distribution without catastrophic damage, effectively neutralizing it as a defensive asset and turning what had been intended as a strong point into a liability that now required protection and repair. And similar actions occurred across the system, each one stripping away a layer of Korl security and confidence. And as losses mounted and the pattern of human operations became unmistakable, the tone of Korl internal communication shifted from certainty to urgency, with reports acknowledging that the humans were not merely reacting, but conducting a planned campaign with clear objectives and phased execution. And it was at this point that Korl Command requested reinforcement and authorization for broader engagement, a request that revealed to their political leadership that the situation was no longer routine enforcement action, but a serious military confrontation. And in halls of the Galactic Concord, the first detailed accounts of these developments began to circulate, causing unease among delegates who had previously dismissed the conflict as a minor dispute. And Ambassador Helen Carter addressed the assembly again, outlining in measured language the scope of the human response, and emphasizing that it followed a defensive doctrine triggered by repeated violations and acts of force, a doctrine that prioritized the rapid neutralization of threats to prevent prolonged instability, and as she spoke, real-time data displays showed the expanding zones of disrupted coral control, the steady advance of human formations, and the careful avoidance of civilian or non-combatant targets, reinforcing the impression that this was not a reckless outburst, but a disciplined, methodical application of power. And back in the contested system, Admiral Paul Grant monitored the unfolding operations and authorized a transition to the next set of objectives, which involved securing key transit corridors and establishing positions from which human forces could interdict any further coral reinforcements, effectively turning the coral forward deployment into an isolated pocket. And this move, executed with speed and coordination, further tightened the strategic noose, making it increasingly clear to coral commanders that their initial assumption of human passivity had led them into a situation for which their existing plans and doctrines had not prepared them. And as a reality of this, miscalculations settled in. The psychological impact began to rival the physical losses, because a belief that humans were inherently reluctant to fight had been a foundation of Korl's strategic planning, and its sudden collapse left them facing not only a capable opponent, but one whose restraint had been a choice, not a limitation. A realization that would soon force both the Korl Dominion and the wider galaxy to reassess what the revelation of the human war doctrine truly meant for the balance of power among the stars. As the human interdiction lines closed and the coral forward forces found their routes of reinforcement and retreat narrowing, the third operational phase unfolded with a focus on decisive demonstration, not merely to win the local engagement, but to communicate a strategic message that would be understood far beyond the contested system. And this phase was built around the principle that an opponent's will could be broken by showing, with unmistakable clarity, that every escalation they attempted only deepened their disadvantage. And so while Korl High Command hurriedly assembled additional fleets and issued orders for a counteroffensive meant to reassert dominance, they discovered that their movements were anticipated almost as soon as they were conceived, because human intelligence networks, long dismissed as competent but unremarkable, had in fact woven a dense web of observation and analysis that now fed real-time assessments into the integrated command structure, allowing human planners to position forces in ways that intercepted, delayed, or redirected coral reinforcements before they could mass effectively. And in several key corridors, coral squadrons emerging from jump were met not by a single blocking force, but by layered formations that combined electronic warfare, long-range precision fire, and mobile reserve units, creating engagement zones where coral ships were forced to maneuver under constant pressure, their formations breaking apart as they tried to respond to threats from multiple vectors. And in these encounters, the human doctrine of coordinated escalation became fully visible, as initial contact was followed by rapid reinforcement and adaptation, each wave of action informed by the results of the last, compressing the timeline of decision and response until the coral commanders found themselves reacting to situations that had already changed by the time their orders were executed, and within the isolated pocket of their original forward deployment, conditions grew steadily worse, with logistics disrupted, repair facilities overwhelmed, and morale strained by the realization that relief was not arriving on schedule. And in internal communications, Korl officers began to question the assumptions that had guided their original mission, acknowledging that the humans were operating with a level of strategic depth and preparation that suggested long-term planning rather than improvised defense. And this acknowledgement marked a critical shift, because it meant that the image of humanity as a species that relied primarily on diplomacy and limited force was no longer tenable, replaced by the recognition that beneath that surface lay a comprehensive approach to warfare that integrated political, informational, and military actions into a single coherent whole. And in the Galactic Concord, this realization spread as reports became clearer and more consistent, prompting urgent consultations among major powers about the implications of human doctrine that could achieve such effects in so short a time. And Ambassador Helen Carter, in closed sessions with key delegates, spoke plainly about the philosophy behind it, explaining that humanity's history had taught at the cost of unpreparedness and the danger of half measures, and that the doctrine was designed not for conquest, but for deterrence through credible ability to impose decisive outcomes when deterrence failed. And as she spoke, news arrived that a major coral reinforcement group had been forced to withdraw after sustaining losses and failing to break through human-controlled corridors, a development that confirmed that the balance initiative had shifted And back in operational theater, Admiral Paul Grant authorized a series of actions aimed at sealing that shift, ordering precision strikes against remaining Korl Command ships and coordination nodes, not to annihilate them outright, but to further degrade their ability to synchronize, ensuring that any attempt at a large-scale counterstroke would be fragmented and delayed. And these strikes, executed with the same measured discipline as the earlier phases, sent a clear signal that the humans were not merely defending their territory, but systematically dismantling the Korl capacity to continue to fight on their terms. And as the Korl Dominion's political leadership absorbed these developments, they faced a growing internal debate between those who argued for escalation to restore honor and those who recognized that the assumptions underpinning their confidence had been fundamentally wrong, and that continuing along the same path would only compound the losses. And it was in this atmosphere of strategic and psychological pressure that the true weight of the revealed war doctrine began to be felt, not just as a set of military procedures, but as an expression of a mindset, one that combined restraint with readiness, patience with precision, and a deep understanding that peace, to be lasting, sometimes required the willingness and the capability to fight with overwhelming clarity of purpose. With the Korl counteroffensive blunted and their forward forces increasingly isolated, the conflict entered a phase where the human command chose to reveal the final and most sobering element of its doctrine, the principle that victory was not merely the defeat of enemy units, but the collapse of their ability to believe in a successful outcome. And this was pursued through a combination of relentless operational pressure and carefully controlled communication, as human fleets maintained their interdiction lines and continued precision actions that further eroded Korl logistics and coordination, while at the same time diplomatic channels carried unambiguous statements outlining conditions under which hostilities could cease, conditions that emphasized withdrawal from occupied systems, recognition of human sovereignty, and guarantees against future incursions. And these terms were presented not as demands backed by bluster, but as a logical conclusion of a situation in which the Korl no longer possessed the initiative, and within the isolated pocket, Korl crews began to experience the full strain of this reality, with repair cycles falling behind, supply levels dropping, and the constant presence of human patrols and surveillance, creating a sense of being watched and anticipated at every move. And in internal reports, Korl officers noted the disciplined pattern of human operations, the way engagements were initiated and then broken off once objectives were achieved, the consistent avoidance of unnecessary destruction, and the unmistakable impression that their opponents were executing a plan with clear end states rather than improvising in pursuit of vengeance or spectacle. And this impression filtered upward to Korl political leadership, where debates grew increasingly intense, with some arguing that the honor of the Dominion required a dramatic escalation, while others, informed by intelligence assessments and a steady accumulation of setbacks, warned that such escalation would likely trigger even more severe phases of the human doctrine, phases whose full scope had not yet been tested. And in the Galactic Concord, the broader implications were now impossible to ignore, as delegates from multiple powers compared notes and recognized that the humans had demonstrated an ability to integrate military action, legal justification, and strategic communication in a way that left little room for misinterpretation. And Ambassador Helen Carter, addressing a closed session, summarized the situation with calm precision, stating that humanity had shown both the capacity and the restraint to apply decisive force, and that the doctrine now revealed was intended to ensure that any future challenges would be met with clarity rather than prolonged instability. And as these discussions unfolded, a critical moment arrived in the contested system, when a Korl command ship, attempting to coordinate a breakout by the remnants of the forward force, found its efforts neutralized by a synchronized human operation that disabled its communication arrays and maneuvering systems without destroying the vessel, leaving it adrift and forcing its crew to confront the fact that they were at the mercy of an opponent who could have ended them, but chose instead to demonstrate control. And this act, more than any single exchange of fire, resonated through Korl ranks, because it underscored the imbalance that had emerged, and as messages from stranded units and isolated commanders reached Korl High Command, the tone shifted from defiance to urgent reassessment, and it became clear that the belief in human reluctance to fight had not only been wrong, but dangerously so, because the doctrine now on display showed a species that had studied war in all its dimensions and had prepared not just to survive it, but to bring it to a swift and structured conclusion. And as negotiations began to take on a more serious and realistic character, the final understanding started to form, both within the Korl Dominion and among the watching powers of the galaxy, that the revelation of the human war doctrine marked a turning point, a moment when a long-standing image of humanity as merely peaceful had been replaced by the recognition that their peace was guarded by a depth of preparation and a unity of purpose that made provoking them a risk few would be willing to take again. When the final phase unfolded, it did so not with a massive annihilating strike, but with a sequence of events that made the outcome undeniable to every level of core authority and to every observing power in the galaxy, as human forces completed the encirclement of the forward deployment, stabilized the contested system under layered defense, and then, in a coordinated and transparent manner, opened secure channels to Korl Command and to the Galactic Concord, presenting verified data that showed the full extent of the operational picture, the loss of Korl Command cohesion, the isolation of their units, the control of key transit routes by human fleets, and the readiness of additional reserves positioned far beyond the immediate theater. And this presentation was accompanied by a calm statement from President Daniel Harper, delivered through Ambassador Helen Carter, that the human war doctrine had been fully activated in response to aggression, that its objectives had been achieved, and that further escalation would only deepen the strategic imbalance already evident. And he outlined again the terms for de-escalation and withdrawal, making clear that humanity sought not humiliation of the Korl Dominion, but the restoration of lawful borders and the establishment of guarantees that such an incursion would never be repeated. And within Korl leadership circles, the effect of this clarity was profound, because the evidence left little room for the comforting illusions that had once guided their confidence, and reports from trapped commanders, stranded logistics groups, and disrupted reinforcement fleets all pointed to the same conclusion, that the humans were not improvising, not acting out of rage, but executing a comprehensive plan whose next steps could be predicted in outline but not countered in practice. And the realization spread that every additional attempt to force a victory would only trigger further layers of that plan, layers that would likely extend the conflict into Korl core regions and impose costs far beyond what had already been suffered. And so, after intense internal debate, Korl political authorities authorized their representatives to accept the framework proposed by humanity, to order a phased withdrawal from the contested system, and to submit to Concord mediation under terms that acknowledge their violation and the consequences that had followed. And when this decision was communicated to the isolated forward units, the response was one of weary relief as much as formal obedience, because those crews had come to understand, through direct experience, the precision and restraint with which the human forces operated, and the fact that they had been contained rather than exterminated stood as a silent demonstration of the doctrine's purpose, to end the threat decisively while limiting unnecessary destruction. And as Korl ships began their withdrawal under human and Concord supervision, the wider galaxy watched, closely, absorbing the lesson that had been delivered not through rhetoric but through action, that the long years in which humanity had chosen negotiation, compromise, and cooperation had never been a result of weakness, but of a deliberate preference for a peace backed by a deeply prepared and carefully structured capacity for war. And in the Concord chambers, delegates spoke in quieter tones than before, recalculating assumptions, revising strategic assessments, and acknowledging that a new factor had entered the balance of power, a species that had shown it could integrate law, diplomacy, information, and force into a single coherent response, and that when pushed beyond the limits of patience, it could act with unity and effectiveness that left no doubt about its ability to defend its place among the stars, and for humanity itself. The conclusion of the crisis brought neither celebration nor triumphalism, but a sober recognition that a line had been crossed, that the war, doctrine once hidden, had now been revealed, and that its revelation would shape how other civilizations approached Earth and its colonies in the years to come, with greater caution, greater respect, and a clearer understanding that peace with humans was not a default condition granted by their nature alone, but a mutual choice. Sustained by the knowledge that behind their calm words and patient diplomacy stood a resolve and a capability that would ensure they were never again mistaken for a species that could be tested without consequence.